Okay, so I left out my introductory slide, so I'll just introduce myself. So I am Dr. Doug Lucas, Ashley's husband. I work currently for another week at Mercy Regional Medical Center as an orthopedic surgeon. That's my day job. My job by night is nutrition consulting, and I have a strong interest in nutrition based on my experience with my family and with my patients, and really have enjoyed working with Ashley and helping to develop and learn about nutrition. And so it's been very compelling for me to play a bigger role in learning for myself, and then being able to pass that on to my patients and clients. So I'm actually happy to be up here talking about it. Okay, so I have a couple of quotes. I'm going to change this up here because I can't read it. There we go. Okay, so first quote. "We are beyond question the greatest sugar consumers in the world, and many of our diseases may be attributed to too free use of sweet food." How long ago do you think this was said? 1857, that was almost a long time. Second one. "I am not prepared to look back at my time here in this parliament doing this job and say to my children's generation, I'm sorry. We knew there was a problem with sugary drinks, we knew it caused disease, but we ducked the difficult decisions and we did nothing." 2016. So the problem hasn't changed, and the response to the problem hasn't really changed in over 150 years. However, what has changed is the amount of sugar that we're actually consuming as a population. So these are difficult numbers to estimate, but these numbers are estimated for the American population going back to pre-1800, when essentially sugar wasn't a part of the diet because it didn't really exist, to current estimates of 180 pounds per person per year. That's a half a pound of sugar a day. That is a lot of sugar. And so we'll talk about kind of how that happens and how, nobody here thinks that they eat a half a pound of sugar a day, but it's possible that you do and you don't even know it. So what exactly are we talking about? What is sugar? There are lots of different sugars available as nutrients in the diet, but the two that we're going to talk about most specifically are glucose and fructose, and when they're combined together, table sugar, which is sucrose. Glucose is what we talk about when we're discussing blood sugar. That's what your body converts everything to if it's going to travel around in the bloodstream as a sugar. Fructose is known as fruit sugar. That is a nutrient that we can consume, which then gets processed in a different way, as we'll talk about. And then sucrose, again, is the combination of fructose and glucose together. So sugar is a macronutrient. It is defined as a carbohydrate. It is a carbohydrate. It is grouped in the same group as grains and starches, but it is the most potent of that group and has a very specific metabolic pathway. Even though everything can be broken down into sugar, because it's so pure, is particularly important. Protein and dietary fat are different categories. Dietary fat, most notably, has over double the amount of calories per gram, which people have thought is quite significant for quite a long time. And I'll talk about why it's not as significant as maybe you think. So glucose. Glucose was originally on the World Health Organization list of essential medications. It was not listed as a food. It was so because people who have issues with hypoglycemia or diabetes need glucose. It is actually life-saving. However, when it's processed, it's absorbed directly into the bloodstream. That results in that spike of insulin that Dr. Lucas talked about. Insulin results in the glucose being pushed into the cells, and it is either stored as glycogen until those cells are full of glycogen, or it's converted into fat, either in somewhere in the body or in the liver. Fructose, on the other hand, has a completely different metabolic pathway, and this is extremely important. Fructose, when consumed when absorbed by the intestine, goes directly to the liver. It is not regulated by insulin. The liver has to metabolize it itself, so it has one of two options. Either it converts it to hepatic glycogen or liver glycogen, so that's energy source for the liver itself, or it converts it to a fatty acid, so it converts it to fat. The fat that it prefers to convert it to is a saturated fat. That saturated fat is then either kept in the liver and stored in the liver, or it's packaged on a triglyceride and sent around the body. So I'm going to run through that one more time. Fructose goes directly to the liver, becomes saturated fat, and gets sent out into the bloodstream. So I'll talk more about this, but for over 100 years now we've been trying to research fat and why dietary fat causes high levels of saturated fat in the bloodstream, and the wrong approach the whole time. So sucrose, table sugar. Again, sucrose, because of its glucose component mostly, was originally marketed as a drug. It was not marketed as a food product until the turn of the 19th century, late 1800s. It was originally designed as a drug because it has such a potent effect on the brain. Just like other drugs like cocaine, heroin, alcohol, it stimulates the reward center and it causes the brain to secrete dopamine. When you have a dopamine secreting substance, it has the ability to suffer tolerance just like anything else. So the more you consume of it, the less the effect is, the more you need. Whenever you are consuming an addictive substance, it can wipe out everything else in your life that is supposed to cause pleasure. Hanging out with your kids, enjoying a sunset. All of those things are then lessened because you have this addictive substance in your life. There are actually 14 times more receptors for sugar in your brain than there are for cocaine. So it's very powerful, and that's why it's a common substitute for addicts who are dealing with addiction and trying to get out of other drugs, because sugar is a good substitute, at least temporarily, for some of those substances. High fructose corn syrup, which gets a lot of media attention, is essentially just processed cornstarch. It comes in several versions, but HFCS 55 is what is in most foods, and it's 55% fructose, 45% glucose, formulated that way because it's just a little bit sweeter than sucrose. The monosaccharides, the fructose and the glucose in high fructose corn syrup, are not connected like they are in table sugar. They are individual, so they can be absorbed even faster. It comes as a liquid, it's easily dissolved in cold fluids, so it can be made into drinks very easily, and it's even less expensive than sugar. So I'm going to describe a couple of medical conditions. I do so not to make this boring, but to circle around back to the concept of insulin resistance, which Dr. Luke just talked about. So metabolic syndrome gets a fair amount of, we lost all our Zoom folks. Sorry, Zoom folks. Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of conditions that consists of elevated blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, abdominal fat distribution, and abnormal cholesterol, most notably elevated triglycerides. If you have metabolic syndrome, you're at increased risk for heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. This is straight off the Mayo Clinic website. I didn't make this stuff up. They also note that all of the conditions associated with metabolic syndrome are associated with insulin resistance. Insulin resistance, again, is the situation that we get into when we consume too much carbohydrate or above our carbohydrate tolerance level. You'll see that those red words over and over again. Diseases of Western lifestyle, it's a group of diseases that in the United States comprises 5 of the top 10 causes of death. They include heart disease, diabetes, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's disease. Annual cost to the United States alone, $1 trillion a year. Again, all related to insulin resistance. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This one gets much less media coverage because it's hard to say. There's also an acronym called NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Basically what it means is that your body is accumulating fat in your liver. And it's very common. 1 out of 4 Americans, 25% of the adult population has this problem. Look around the room. It's a lot of us. So I looked a little bit deeper into the research on this because I didn't know that much about it. And interestingly, the research on the human research is showing that it's highly dependent on the constituents of the diet. Meaning that if you consume a high sugar diet, the liver lipogenic rates, the ability of the liver to make fat, goes through the roof. If you take that sugar out and substitute it for dietary fat, the liver lipogenic rates go down. If you want to give somebody a fatty liver, feed them fructose, and they will make a fatty liver very reliably. If you take the fructose out, the fatty liver goes away. Diabetes is the end product of insulin resistance. I think we've all heard of that one. Diabetes, if you have it, puts you at increased risk for heart disease, stroke, kidney disease, eye problems, dental problems, neuropathy, foot ulcers, and amputations. Most notably in my practice. But amputations from diabetes are the most common cause of amputation in the United States, with 73,000 performed in 2010. There are 12 classes of drugs for diabetes alone. The market for drugs and devices for diabetes is $30 billion a year. 1 out of 11 Americans are diabetic. My question is, how many of those are actually insulin resistant and are just on their way? So the debate of whether or not sugar should be part of the diet is not new. It has been around since, really, sugar has been around. In the 1670s, Dr. Thomas Willis, the medical advisor to the Duke of York and King Charles II, noted that when sugar began flowing into England and the people that could afford it started putting it in their tea, that people started developing diabetes. He called it the pissing evil. But he associated it with sugar, and little did he know how right he was. Dr. Fred Slayer, of the same time era, was on the other side of the argument and said that to defraud infants of sugar is a very cruel thing, if not a crying sin. And he defended sugar by anecdotal evidence of his patients that did well and ate a lot of sugar, probably very carbohydrate tolerant. But not everybody agreed. There was a school of physicians and researchers in both Europe and in the United States that identified that if you had somebody who was lean and they consumed sugar, they tended to fatten, and they were concerned that the fattening of lean people could also cause other problems like diabetes. But they didn't have the ability at the time to connect to, because they didn't have the technology. It wasn't until Elliot Jocelyn in the early 1900s where the concept of sugar is a carbohydrate, all carbohydrates are processed the same, and calorie is a calorie really began to take life. This school of thought uses the first rule of thermodynamics, which I'll talk about in detail, and really blames dietary fat because it has more calories than carbohydrates. And that must be the cause of obesity, and that must be the cause of diabetes. So Elliot Jocelyn is the godfather of diabetes in the United States. This is his 14th version of this book. So everybody knows that he studied diabetes throughout his entire career, no question. He saw his first case of diabetes in 1893 when he was a medical student at Massachusetts General Hospital. He looked through all of the patients at that time and found that in the history of Mass Gen, there was a prevalence of diabetes of 0.3%. Fast forward 120 years, the American Diabetes Association says that we are just under 10% of the American population, that's 30 million people. 26% of the American population is pre-diabetic, that's 84 million people. And again, my question is, how many people are insulin resistant? This is the slide from Dr. Lucas's lecture demonstrating the rates of obesity, and you can imagine those two things have certainly climbed together, so there's at least an association. So the energy balance hypothesis, to look a little bit more closely at this, it says very clearly that obesity results from eating too much and exercising too little. Traditionally, the observation was that obese individuals seem to be hungrier and they seem to be less active. The traditional literature from physicians use the terms gluttony and sloth, if you want to try to use the 7 deadly sins to justify something. And then they use the first law of thermodynamics. So this is also called the law of conservation of energy. And essentially, it describes that the total energy of a system is constant, that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. And the advocates for this theory at the time said that means that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie is a calorie, and you're just eating too many calories. So, lots of people believe that from the early 1900s on, in both Europe and in America. Louis Newberg was one of the most vocal and well-published of the group that believed this. And some of his quotes are that all obese persons are alike in one fundamental respect, that they literally overeat. He described this as a perverted appetite, and that they have a lessened outflow of energy. And what was very significant about these comments is that it changed obesity from a medical problem to a psychological problem and turned it over to a completely different field of medicine, which at that time was very, very underdeveloped. But not everybody believed that. There was a German school that believed that there was some kind of hormonal defect, but this is pre-World War II time, and they didn't have the technology to prove it. Julius Bauer was a geneticist, and he believed that there was a genetic component, and he studied twins, and he would look at twins and identify that, gosh, these twins are putting fat on the same locations. There has to be something about their genes that is causing fat to be deposited in these locations. But again, didn't have the technology to prove it. So if you look at this equation of the first law of thermodynamics, it really doesn't say what most people are saying that it says. It literally says from the beginning that a change in internal energy, that's delta U, is equal to the amount of heat supplied minus work done. That doesn't sound anything like a calorie is a calorie. However, if you put those in nutrition terms, it'll say the change in your body equals calories consumed minus calories expended. And that a positive energy balance, meaning that you consume too many calories, is required to become obese. That is absolutely true. I'm not going to argue that it's not. However, the equal sign does not have a direction to it. you cannot say that just because you consumed more calories or increased Q, that the delta U is going to go up, because there's 3 variables. So take, for example, child growth. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. They're growing quite rapidly. Are they growing quite rapidly because I feed them a lot of food? No, of course not. If I run them around the house, are they going to grow less? Probably not, unless I run them a lot. So hormonal events can drive the left side of the equation, meaning that the change in the body can be driven from within the body. And the change in your calories consumed and the change in the activity out can be a result of what's happening within the body. So take some other examples, some hormonal events in life. Most of these are in women's lives, sorry. Pregnancy, menopause, puberty, all instances where the body changes as a result of a hormonal drive. It's not because we're eating more. It's not because we're working out less. Exercise, if you want to just look at the right side of the equation, if you train for the Iron Horse, what happens? She mentioned it earlier. You get really hungry, right? You eat more, and that's your body trying to stay the same. You've increased your W, so you have to increase your Q, right? So you have to eat more to compensate for the amount of activity that you're doing. Similarly, if you starve yourself, if you have enough willpower, you can do it for a while, but eventually you will fail. You can't starve yourself forever. Your body will drive hunger up. It will tell you to eat more, and if you don't, it will tell you to move less. So you're not going to want to go for that run. You're not going to want to ride your bike. You're going to feel bad. So the hormonal explanation was actually carrying a lot of emphasis, particularly in Europe pre-World War II. And there were multiple researchers that were publishing this and saying that basically fat cells are accumulating excess calories and keeping them from being used, and that hunger and lethargy are the result of obesity, not the cause. The gluttony and the sloth are the result of getting fat, not the other way around. In other words, we don't get fat because we eat too much. We eat too much because we get fat. So visceral fat, they describe it as a malignant tumor, and that's been carried on through some publications up until now, and is one of the guidelines from the PhD approach. All right, so that hypothesis did carry over to the US, and it started to catch some weight, but unfortunately World War II happened, and unfortunate for a number of reasons. But when World War II happened, all the German literature was lost. The Austrian literature was gone. The American literature gained support, and the ideology of Jocelyn and all of his supporters, it was all accepted as dogma, even though the evidence was very minimal. The diet-heart hypothesis, which is the look from the science standpoint to look at dietary fat as the cause for cardiovascular disease, that really picked up momentum, and the idea that a calorie is a calorie and the energy balance hypothesis was just accepted as dogma and true, and it's because fat has 9 calories per gram and carbohydrates have 4. And then insulin came along. They knew about it for a long time, but they couldn't prove it. They couldn't say how much was in the body. And so these researchers, Rosalind Yalow and Salomon Burson, developed this thing called a radioimmunoassay technique, which allows you to determine how much insulin is actually in the body. And we talked about the insulin role already. What they determined is that insulin is the most lipogenic of all the hormones, meaning that it will put more energy in a fat cell than anything else. In fact, most hormones will pull energy out of the fat cell. But insulin is a bully, and insulin won't let any of the other hormones do it until you take the insulin out, and then the other hormones can do their job and take the energy out of the fat cells. These researchers, Wilhelm Falta and Harold Hemsworth, identified that type 2 diabetics had an increased level of insulin, and they coined the term insulin resistance. That's where that came from. Yalow and Burson then followed that by saying, gosh, they also have high levels of blood glucose. We should call this thing hyperinsulinism, which was hard to say, so they changed it to hyperinsulinemia, which is what we call it today. And essentially what that is chronic high levels of insulin that cause the body to be in a fed state or in a state where the fat cells are pulling in energy all the time until you can get those insulin levels down. So the hormonal hypothesis was then completed, but it was a little bit too late. But the hypothesis essentially states that sugar consumption causes increases in insulin. Insulin resistance causes hyperinsulinemia, or that chronic fed state, which results in obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and so on and so on. So if you go back and look at the energy hypothesis, what did happen in the interim is that the studies, these massive, hundreds of millions of dollar studies, looking at dietary fat as the cause of heart disease were going on, and they were being published. And it turns out that even though dietary fat has more calories per gram, they had a really hard time proving that dietary fat caused obesity. They had a really hard time proving that dietary fat resulted in poor cholesterol levels. They had a really hard time proving that dietary fat caused heart disease. They didn't disprove it, but they had a hard time proving it. What they did prove is that obesity is still associated with diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and heart disease, which we already knew. And I would argue that obesity is likely the result of something other than dietary fat. So sugar continues to get a free ride as a nutrient, as a carbohydrate, and it's difficult at this point, from a political standpoint, to take sugar out of the diet because there's such a tremendous body behind sugar, both politically, financially, and unfortunately, even in the Obama era, when Michelle Obama had her Let's Move campaign, when they were trying to make America as healthy as possible, she even said, this is not about demonizing any industry. So, right, we don't want to say sugar's bad, however, you should eat less empty calories. But what happened in the 20th century is because of the fat phobia, all the fat got pulled out of our food and sugar was substituted in. So how do you not eat empty calories when it's in everything that's available to eat? So where are we headed? That's challenging to say. The studies that were done on dietary fat, to reproduce those and do them on sugar at this point would cost billions with a B of dollars, would require hundreds of thousands of subjects, and nobody's going to do it. The government's not going to do it. Industry's not going to do it. Pharmaceutical companies aren't going to do it because there's no money to be made in taking sugar out of the diet, unfortunately. But we can look at some interesting isolated populations that were westernized very late, and because they were westernized very late, we were able to observe what happened in those populations over time. So, the Tokelau Islands, which are off the coast of New Zealand, didn't really get westernized until the 1960s. If you look at them now, they have the highest prevalence of diabetes of any country in the world, almost 40%. 70% of the population is obese. In the 1960s, they realized they had a population problem on the islands, and so they offered the Tokelauans to go to the mainland of New Zealand. And they said, we'll move you there, we'll find you jobs, we'll put you up, and we'll get you going on the mainland. Epidemiologists loved this concept because they said, ooh, we can look at a population on an island and on the mainland and we can see what happens. So they had these two groups, immigrants, islanders, from similar ethnic background, which helps control some of the variation. And what happened is they looked at the kind of what they ate before they moved. Sorry, that's so small. Before they moved, and most of their diet was coconuts, fish, pork, chicken, some starchy melons or root vegetables, but 50% of their calories came from fat. 2% of their total calories came from sugar, and a little bit of flour at 12 pounds per capita, which is 12 pounds per person per year. And a search of the medical records demonstrated that 3% of the men and 9% of the women were diabetic. 14 years later, fat consumption on the island decreased dramatically. Sugar went from 8 pounds to 54 pounds, flour from 12 to 70, so they got westernized in this whole process. The immigrants, however, had an even more rapid shift because they moved to westernization. It was already there. So they stopped eating coconuts, they stopped eating fish, they started eating flour, sugar, potatoes. Their activity did oddly increase, which doesn't explain things because they became laborers essentially. So that doesn't explain what happened to them. In 1982, 14 years later, diabetes was 20% in women, so that doubled 14 years and almost quadrupled in men. Hypertension, heart disease increased. Gout, 9 times as likely on the mainland as on the islands. Obesity, 20 to 30 pounds on average, every single person they looked at. And childhood obesity, which they had never seen before in that group, was not present. So another group that was studied very closely, I'll skip the bulk of what they found out about the Pima Indians, but the Pima Indians in Arizona were similarly studied and westernized very late, and so similarly they had this rapid rise in obesity. And the reason why I bring the Pima up is that even though they started the study in 1965, it was in 1983 that they identified that greater than 50% of the Pima born to diabetic mothers became obese. Over half. This was different, however, than the rates of babies that were born to mothers that became diabetic after pregnancy. And it was even different than the rate of babies that were born to non-diabetic mothers by 3 times. So then 1988 comes around, and 45% of children that were born to the diabetic mothers were now diabetic. They were only in their 20s. So very, very rapid changes. This is contrasted tremendously by 5 times. So that is 5 times the rate of women that were born to diabetics that became diabetic after pregnancy, and 30 times as many people that became diabetic as those born to non-diabetic mothers. So what explains this tremendous shift from generation to generation? And as it turns out, there's this thing called perinatal metabolic programming. So what this says essentially is that whatever is happening in the womb when the baby is being developed has an effect on what happens to that baby as they come out into the world. So increased blood sugar in the womb equals the baby's pancreas, which secretes insulin that is more insulin resistant. It's going to produce more insulin, and these babies are going to be born predisposed to become insulin resistant, obese, and diabetic. So, in summary, sugar was a rapidly increased staple of our diet. Over 100 years, it went from basically non-existent to a tremendous portion of our calories consumed. And as we mentioned earlier, it is obviously being tolerated very poorly. The fat phobia of the 20th century fueled this carbohydrate dominance, and sugar got a free ride. Because of sugar's unique metabolic role, hyperinsulinemia, leading to metabolic syndrome, and fatty liver or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis has become very common and is probably the leading cause of all of these things we mentioned earlier with metabolic syndrome and diseases of westernization. The most concerning thing is the perinatal metabolic programming resulting in obese offspring and them having a decreased carbohydrate tolerance. So when you talk about how much sugar is safe, obviously there's individual variation. Some people that are going to be very carbohydrate tolerant, but a lot of us are not. And my concern is that we're going to see decreasing tolerance over subsequent generations if we haven't already. I'm pretty sure I'm less carbohydrate tolerant than my parents were. Personal responsibility ultimately is the key, and that's why using an approach like the PhD approach that can help identify what your carbohydrate tolerance level is crucial to understanding why you continue to struggle with weight if you do, or if you start to, how to curtail that, because it's difficult once it gets out of